Everything rises and falls on leadership. The ability to lead well is fueled by living your cause and purpose. This podcast will equip you with the tools to do just that. Live and lead with cause and purpose. And now, author of the book, The Anatomy of Leadership, and our host, Chris Como.
Hello and welcome to The Anatomy of Leadership. I'm excited. Our guest today is a good friend and someone I've been working on for a while to get on this show, Jes DeShields. Welcome, Jes. She's the principal consultant and founder of Crescent Leadership. She's also an author of the 9 Leader Touchstones. Welcome, Jes.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, let me read a little bit about you, and I want you to add some stuff to it. So Jes is passionate, I will affirm that, and an engaging storyteller. She cultivates client relationships of transparency, trust, and authentic connection. Her consulting approach focuses on the long game. That's what makes her different. Applying the appropriate infusion of innovation and endurance-based strategies and conscientious culture mapping. We'll talk about what all that means. Jes teaches at Cornell in the Executive Leadership, Women's Leadership, Change Leadership, and Nonprofit Management Certificate Program. She's also a lecturer at the Brooks School of Public Policy. She's a Fascinate certified advisor and trainer, which I actually got the privilege of checking that out. And she also has certificates in leading remote teams, nonprofit leadership, diversity, equity, inclusion. She regularly speaks and writes on the topics of leadership, team dynamics, organizational systems, and sustainable business growth. She founded Crescent Leadership, a business consulting executive coaching firm based on leader-first strategies, which again, we're going to talk about, and her distinct methodology for organizational change. And Jes's essential research was published in her book, 9 Leader Touchstones. I have my copy right here. It is dog-eared. It's got stickies on it. And so we're going to talk about that. It quickly became a hot new bestseller in 2023. So Jes, what did I leave out that you want our audience to know about you?
Well, I think my bio covers a good high-level overview of what moved me to my current path at Crescent Leadership. And certainly some of my earlier experiences working in the nonprofit industry throughout the Carolinas and working for a Fortune 250 company right out of college gave some shape to my background. But I think it's my stories, right, that throughout those experiences that really helped me find the path I was meant to travel, my life's purpose. And to find that path, anybody to find that purpose, we have to be willing to work to interpret our stories without judgment, right, against our current reality. And, Chris, I love what you said in your book, Anatomy of Leadership. You said you cannot lead others if you are not on a journey to master yourself. And this is the very essence of our work at Crescent Leadership. Leaders must first look to self. I've always been on a personal journey to do better, to be better for those around me, to be the best mom to Maddie, to be the best wife I can be to Brian, to be the best sister, daughter, friend, and yes, to be the best leader I can be. But that's taken a lot of self-reflection, introspection, but most importantly, taking action, on what I knew about myself. That's really what got me to where I am at Crescent Leadership and on this journey I'm currently on.
Well, then that leads me, I always love asking our guest about what's your superpower?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. I ask that of just about every leader I work with, and certainly the teams we work with, because that's part of our work is helping them find that superpower. I think for many years I've been hovering around my path, so to speak, like kind of walking alongside it. But when I launched Crescent Leadership 4 years ago, that's when I finally stepped squarely onto it. And I think when you're on your path, when you're living your life's purpose, that's when you uncover your own unique potential. My work at Crescent and spending time over the past 4 years working with leaders across sector, different sizes of organizations around the country, that's when I really started to understand my superpower. It's helping leaders realize that they need to go to this place of introspection, especially if it's been a place they've been scared to travel in the past. And when I can get them to that point, helping them to find the courage to look to self, that's when we start to peel back the layers of those stories, examine those stories, again, without judgment, and then to help them move closer to their purpose so they can find the path they were meant to travel.
That's really good, Jes. And I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but I just get a sense it might be a good question. Why did you call your company Crescent? Is there a story there?
Yeah. So when I think about how I believe, we talk about something in the book, you might remember this, called the crescendo, and this ties to our work on authenticity. In fact, I'm doing a keynote in a couple of weeks, and we're going to talk about the crescendo in this keynote. A crescendo grows, right, like a crescent moon, to the point that it has such impact. And so the idea is that growth of any type, to be sustainable, needs to grow slowly over time to crescendo, right? And so that's why we called it Crescent Leadership, that tie into that word crescendo.
Oh, that's really cool. I actually reached out to Jim Collins over the Christmas holiday and actually got a response, and we corresponded a little bit, and it started kind of going back to his stuff. But the concept of the flywheel that he talked about, that there's an inertia, but at some point, like, it takes a lot of energy to do introspection, right, to learn and grow. But at some point, it's like that thing catches. It's the Atomic Habits guy. I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head. You probably remember. He talks about the valley of latency, and then all of a sudden it's like you get this exponential growth. Is that the same wisdom that you're kind of poking on with that name?
And I think, yes, I love Jim Collins. I have all his books back here on my bookshelf, and I've been studying him for years. But I think that it's that, but it's also the idea that growth should be steady and sustainable, right? That we talk about this a bit in the book, how we often opt for that quick win, right? And when you look at growth trajectories of companies, you will see, lines like this, or you'll see a line like this, but sometimes then that line goes like straight down, right? Just plummets off the cliff. And the idea, though, is that a sustainable growth trajectory intentionally should be slow and methodical, and that's okay, right? To grow slowly over time, you learn as you go so that you can continue that growth trajectory. Does that make sense?
It makes really good sense. I'm so glad I asked you that question. You're making me be introspective, using your superpower right at this moment. I've actually been thinking I need to write a blog on this. And so this podcast will be coming out in February, but you and I are taping it still in the early part of the year. New Year's resolution, right? New year, new me. And one of the things this year that I've just observed about my own self, I'm not going crazy. I'm making small, incremental, and I feel like the changes are sticking, and I'm building off of that. And that feels profound, and that feels the wisdom that you're actually poking on, as I said here, and kind of introspectively think about, my book, The Anatomy of Leadership, the whole the learning journey, being in the learning journey, is the fact that it is a continual journey. Right. I'm a bit of an idealist, and I want to lose 20 pounds tomorrow, and I want to be at that perfect, but it's not reasonable. And you actually set yourself up for failure. So I love that wisdom that you're poking on.
Thank you to our Anatomy of Leadership sponsor, Dragonfly Health. Dragonfly Health is also the title sponsor for Leadership Immersion courses. Dragonfly Health is a leading care-at-home data, technology, and service platform. With a 20-year history, Dragonfly Health uses advanced technology and robust analytics to manage durable medical equipment and pharmaceutical services as part of a single efficient solution for caregivers, patients, and their families. The company serves millions of patients annually across all 50 states. Thank you, Dragonfly Health, for all the great work that you do.
Let's jump into the book. Is that okay? But again, I'm glad I asked you that question. So just because we're gaining new listeners every week. So I've been using my book, The Anatomy of Leadership, as kind of a framework for this podcast. The very first year, we actually kind of themed it by the chapters. And as you probably figured out pretty quickly, Jess, yours is so well researched. I'm an accountant by trade. If you Google the word leadership, you get 6 billion hits. And so my book was meant to be like a table of contents on leadership. Like, how do I dive into this broad body of knowledge? If you use those key themes, it's 10 miles wide, 2 inches deep, but you can spend the rest of your life putting more meat on the bone, going deeper. which is why then I seek out thought leaders like yourself, because I feel like incredible thought leaders then put more meat on the bone. Then the book and the podcast are a great body of work that can pour into people,
Right.
and just help them to be on the learning journey. So that's kind of the idea, and why I love reaching out to you, and I'm so appreciative of a couple of the CEOs in our TCN network that introduced me to you, although it was kind of cool that you and I actually met many, many moons ago, earlier part of your career, and so to get to reconnected. So let's jump into your book, because I do think it puts a whole lot of meat on the bone. You did such great research. You were pretty transparent, maybe building off on your story about your challenging upbringing. You used that story. How did that journey shape who you are today and the work that you're doing?
Let me talk a little bit about where I am now. I'm gonna start a little later, and I'm gonna come back to that if that's okay. I was thinking about when the crescendo happened to me. So I've identified those crescendos in my life, and I've had four major ones that have really changed my trajectory, got me closer to that path. And I think one of the big ones happened in 2020. In my book, I call that time the new Great Awakening, so to speak. The pandemic really changed me, as I know it changed many people. I watched people that I love get sick and die. I spent long hours at home trying to figure out how to teach my 7-year-old Common Core math. I know many friends that did the same thing. And at that time, I was working in an organization where we were doing consulting work for nonprofits around the country. And overnight, we were trying to figure out a way to keep over 100 nonprofits from going under because of the challenges of the pandemic. And I think throughout that time frame, I started feeling very overworked, as many people did, even sitting in this room, right? My job was always remote, but at that point, it became a different kind of remote. And I started feeling the weight of being overworked and undervalued. But then I balanced some of those experiences with good ones. And I think that taught me a lot about where I needed to be as well. I married my husband in a sunrise wedding at the top of a mountain because you weren't going inside of churches and any indoor spaces. So we really didn't think anybody would show up because you'd have to travel up the mountain at 4 a.m. Like 60 people came to this outdoor chapel. It's a pretty place, which I know you know. And it was amazing, right? And we had this experience, and it really opened my eyes, the good and the bad, that I had lost a lot of time in my life, doing work that was helpful in my growth, but probably didn't get me closer to fulfilling that life's purpose. And so sometimes I was doing that work at the expense of my health, which we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of energy-powered resilience in the book. My relationships, right? So I decided to start living. That's when I started Crescent Leadership. But of course, there were so many inflection points on my journey that led me to Crescent Leadership. And there was a point in my life where I started realizing that my early story had the ability to help people. Stories have this amazing ability to give people words that might be challenging to them, right? To say them out loud, to share their own experiences. And so sometimes hearing someone else's stories allow them to start unpacking their own. I remember sharing my story for the first time when I was a 24-year-old loaned executive at United Way. At first, it was hard to talk about what it was like growing up in poverty, surrounded by drug and alcohol addiction. But saying my stories out loud for others, for the sake of their experience, actually had this unintended outcome of helping me start to peel back the layers of my own experience. And I've never really stopped doing that. So, this lifelong journey, as we talk about, has shaped me in some incredible ways. And ultimately, has made me a more effective leadership coach and team coach. Now, the marriage of that with my professional and doctoral experience, my doctoral research on systems and organizational effectiveness, it kind of creates this unique view for me. So my research led me to write 9 Leader Touchstones, but it demonstrates this immutable link between the human behavioral element and sustained organizational growth. So if organizations solely focus on metrics, the bottom line, technology, the next big innovation, they're constructing an unsustainable growth strategy. So I work with them to help them understand that immutable link.
Well, we're going to go there next, but this might be a good segue. So the book was released, was it 2023, Jess? Is that when it was released?
Yes.
I love that you start with Robert Frost's poem, The Road Less Traveled. Why'd you start there? Makes a whole lot of sense to me, but why did you start there?
If anything, we wanted to give leaders a book built on integrity, which is one of the 9 Leader Touchstones. And so that meant being really honest about how hard it can be to choose the challenging, to choose challenging the status quo, for opting for endurable, sustainable growth over those quick and easy wins, building on a foundation of the right human behaviors, looking to self first. This can be a difficult and lonely road. When I was in high school, I competed in poetry interpretation, and The Road Not Taken was one of the poems I presented. And I go back to it anytime I need to summon my own courage to take a more challenging path. To do it, to become a leader first leader, it equips leaders to build this foundation of dynamic, enduring organizations. But sometimes they courageously have to take that road less traveled. But when they do, it makes all the difference. So that's why we started with that poem.
And then I love history, by the way. I'm a bit of a geek, although I feel like you're a cool geek. You're so thoughtful. I'm just self-professed geek. I love history. I love reading leadership books. My guess is you and I have that in common. But love Harry Truman. He's actually one of my favorite presidents. So literally, I think it was on page 1 of your book, the Harry Truman quote: "In periods where there is leadership, society stands still. Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better." I think that was a brilliant quote to start that and just launch into the impacts of negative leadership, which you have some incredible examples. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It was funny. Some of my beta readers thought I made a mistake by kicking off the book with this visceral story about negative leadership and how it built this toxic internal culture. But this is the one piece of feedback I didn't take. And this probably came from years and years of being a professional fundraiser before I got into the world that I'm in now. I knew I had to convince leaders, if I were going to convince them to take this journey, to challenge the status quo, that they needed to understand the need. They needed to understand the need first. Why was it important now? To your point, billions of leadership and organizational change resources at our fingertips daily. Why would I write another book on leadership? I knew I wanted to change the conversation. I had to change the conversation. If my contribution to that very saturated market would be valuable and functional in our current time. Okay. So the quote perfectly sums up what leaders have to do on their journey. When things have become so convoluted, so tangled, courageous leaders have to stand in the gap. When it comes at a high cost to themselves. And this goes back to the road not taken. Some leaders must courageously take the road less traveled. But when they do that, it makes all the difference. That's when we start to see real progress.
There's also another, you say later that the moment you think you've arrived in leadership, and it's so funny, I have a paraphrase quote like this that about once a month pops up in my Getting Things Done system. So that's, again, why it just jumped off of the page at me. The moment you think you've arrived in leadership is the moment when you start to fail your organization. So here's a weird question. So how does a leader balance gaining confidence, that momentum, building to that crescendo, but also not like questioning yourself, am I where I need to be, but also having enough confidence where, hey, I'm looking through the rearview mirror, I do think I've come a ways. How does a leader just balance that where the scales don't get tipped in one extreme or the other, or woe is me, I suck, I'm not growing like I should, or I'm the man or I'm the woman?
I think I'm glad you used the word balance there from a standpoint of making sure that leaders know this journey is not about perfectionism, right? Mm-hmm. It is a journey. I'll tell you a little story. A few months ago, I was on a leader coaching call with a client, and she said something that really brilliantly encapsulated this idea. She said, I always had the insatiable desire to learn and grow, which I can relate to, right? This curiosity bug. But she said, I think that what sets me apart, that's the thing that sets me apart as a leader for my team. But she also creates spaces for them to grow as well. And she said that it doesn't mean that we don't stop, celebrate the small and big wins, and reflect on where we are, but we reflect intentionally, right? It means that when we reflect, we always do it from a place of curiosity, asking good questions. What have we learned about, the things that didn't go well? And how do we capitalize on what went well? And what makes that conversation's context really interesting is that we were talking about how she is finally in a place where she feels like the pace is slowing to a manageable level. You see, her organization has been on the other side of digging out of a significant decline for something like 7-8 years now. And it's taken them this long to get to a place where they can say that they are sustainably growing. But she knows that to continue that trajectory, while they may rest, they also have to continue to move. So now that they're in the position, or they're positioning themselves to anticipate and prepare for disruption, right? The bad kind of disruption, disruptive external or even internal threats. Like if the pandemic had hit them at the beginning of this journey, they likely would have closed their doors. That's the balance, right? Rest but move, celebrate but move, learn but move.
The adage that I use, I don't know if this resonates with you, Jess, and again, I love that you're so thoughtful. I'm sitting here, you're making me be introspective. I will say that at this point in my life, 54 years, that I have a healthy satisfaction with where I am and a healthy dissatisfaction with where I am. And that's kind of my way of saying what I feel like you're poking on. Would you say that differently, or just push back on that phrase? Is there, because I also love the other thing you keep poking on. I'm a huge Shameen fan, positive intelligence. That term of going up on the balcony of your life is a great visual metaphor. Why storytelling works so well, right? It paints pictures. And if you end up with great metaphors, it does the same thing, just a little bit more succinctly. And so my mentor, Dr. Lee Thayer, who mentored Stephen Covey, would use the term decenter yourself or project yourself to the ceiling. All those are great terms, and what I feel like you're poking on of being introspective. But again, kind of bringing it back to full circle, my way of trying to encapsulate this journey is healthy satisfaction, healthy dissatisfaction. Is good wisdom, or would you push back on that?
No, I love the way you described that, because I think that the satisfaction piece comes with our move toward becoming more authentic, which, as you know, is one of the 9 Leader Touchstones, right? So as we get closer to authenticity, I think there is a time where we can get closer to arriving there, right? And that's where the satisfaction comes in. But when you start to kind of unpack the brain science behind how these touchstones like interact with one another, for instance, emotional intelligence. I work with leaders that, if you know anything about emotional intelligence, you know that it's a progression of really 4 states, right? You have self-awareness, which is focused on self and being aware of self. Then you have regulation of emotion, which is focused on self and regulating your emotion. Then you have social awareness, which is focused on others and understanding their emotions. And then relationship management or facilitation of performance, that's really focused on how you use what you know about your emotions and the emotions of others to facilitate a good outcome. And that's how we describe emotional intelligence in the book. I work with leaders all the time that believe they've arrived at emotional intelligence. And what I will tell you about emotional intelligence that some people don't understand is you may go take an assessment today and have off the chart, scores on those 4 progressions. But if something major changes in your life, okay, say we get hit by a pandemic, or you move to another state, or something changes in your family unit, something changes on your team, your company goes through a major organizational change. All of those changes introduce new triggers into your life that you've not yet done the work on to contribute to your emotional intelligence. So that's one of those touchstones that we have to work our entire life. We never arrive in that one, right? So that's what I mean by, I love your concept of the balance, right? Some of these we get closer to, but some we have to continue to work no matter what.
I'm working on my second book, Justin. I don't know if I'll do this on the front cover of this, but I always said I'm going to write a book one day, and the front cover is going to have this graph that is going to be like this squiggly line, and it's like going up and down and backwards, and then at least the trend line is to the good, but it's that kind of up and down and backwards, and hopefully those troughs and backslidings are not as deep as they've been in the past. But another way of kind of visually representing what I think you poke on. Does that feel pretty accurate to you?
Absolutely. Yes. I think the design, we have kind of this image in the book of these series of ladders where you're going, kind of like a jungle gym, kind of back and forth. But what I say in there when you're looking at this is that at any given point, you may have to go all the way back down to the bottom and start. It doesn't mean you get to the top. Sometimes you go to step 2 and then you have to come back down and start again, right? Yep. And that's okay. That's definitely okay. That's what makes it a journey.
My girls, for Christmas, the grandparents gave them one of the old Atari games like we had, but it has like all the games. I don't know if you remember Pitfall when we were younger, where you're like going along and there's a hole and you fall back down and you got to climb the ladder and get back up. That's kind of another visual that I get. Yeah, I feel like all this has been good prelude. So talk about the leader first leadership model. And I have to admit, because I've been so hardwired for leadership, like even when I was like writing like the questions I wanted to ask you, I kept wanting to type in leadership first leadership model. But I feel like you very deliberately chose that title, leader first leadership model. And so please talk about it.
So, I've been working on this for a long time. I think at some point I maybe said this to you already, but I started this research really back when I was doing my dissertation research. So it's been a long time coming. But then again, when I started Crescent Leadership and was working with leaders, hearing those stories, getting the chance to work with them and put these concepts to work, so to speak, that's when I could really start to put it on paper, to really create something tangible that leaders could use as a tool. So when I started really getting serious about writing the book and getting this model out more broadly beyond our customer base, my goal is to share a model that would quell the unique challenges, right, that we have in our current state of work. And that meant really kind of examining everything we knew about leadership, or as much as I possibly could. And what I found was that we have so many leadership disciplines and philosophies in the world that I didn't need to create something new. What's new about leader first leadership is how I pull in 3 distinct philosophies of leadership as the combination of philosophies that are needed in our current state of work. Okay, so leader first leadership embodies the tenets of systems leadership, behavioral leadership, and shared leadership. But it goes back to that fundamental premise that leaders first look to self. Now, I often get, you were talking about the word leader, why leader versus leadership. I often feel the need to dispel any misguided interpretations of the phrase leader first. Leader first leadership is not about putting the leader first. Mm-hmm. It's about putting people first. But that can only happen when leaders are willing to first introspectively examine how their behavior's profound influence shapes bottom line outcomes, right? Everybody cares about the bottom line. We can't get to the bottom line. The bottom line comes way later. We have to first go all the way back to the behavioral influence. And so even though leaders must look first to themselves, it's not about leadership in isolation and action, achievement, or celebration. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. I've told many of the leaders that I work with over the years, and I still fervently believe it, that if leadership feels lonely at the top, you're probably doing it wrong.
That's so good.
You feel lonely at the top,
Yep. You will laugh. So I didn't have the best first leader in the hospice space. And I had these wonderful group of ladies. They were all much older than me. I was 25 in my first senior leader job. And so these ladies almost felt like moms. And so they kind of looked at me as like their son. So they gave me all these really cool gifts as I was leaving to get my first CEO role. And one of them, because the CEO that we worked for was very fond of saying, "It's lonely at the top." And they gave me a little vanity mirror and they wrote on it, "We all know how lonely it is at the top. Maybe this is the only person you could talk to." And it's kind of a funny way of the exact opposite of what you're poking on, but it's funny. I actually used to keep it on my desk, not because I'm some kind of vanity freak, but that John Maxwell leadership lesson that if you've been in the leadership role more than 3 years, you probably should look in the mirror because there's a good chance you're looking at the person who's had a lot to do with the situation that you're currently in. But again, that whole thing, it's lonely at the top and literally used to do it. It's just kind of a very funny way of sticking in my brain. Yeah. Well, I want to get to the 9 touchstones because it just, the framing of that. So what are the 9 touchstones? And please do talk about the framing. I think it's brilliant what you're poking on. I don't remember if it was how far it was into the book, but I really got what you were after with the 9 touchstones, because at first I'm like, when I looked at the book and the cover and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, but it felt much more profound as I got into the detail and what you're poking on with this.
Well, to clarify that, the first half of the book is all about the model, right? And how the model works, how we build sustainable culture, how culturing is a critical action inside an organization and a growth strategy. And then in the entire second half of the book is that guide for leaders, right? Where we really unpack all 9 touchstones, and then we go through the brain science behind those 9 touchstones. And then we actually talk about what we call touchstone Tai Chi, how to cultivate the touchstones first in yourself, but then even some work in how you start to cultivate that in your team members, right? So the more ripples we create inside the workplace, it has this crescendoing effect, right? Where it grows significantly faster when more people are infusing the behaviors into the organizational system. Okay. So the 9 touchstones, think of them as healthy or constructive leader behaviors. And these are the fuel for the dynamic, enduring organizational system. Okay. The 9 touchstones are curiosity, emotional intelligence, courage, integrity, authenticity, empathy, gratitude, inclusivity, and resilience. Now, through my research, I've discovered that cultivating some touchstones are more challenging, if not impossible, without a foundation of what I call the big 3. The big 3 are curiosity, emotional intelligence, and courage. I would say that most people who pick up my book already have some foundation of those 3. Okay. They're willing to look to self. They're emotionally intelligent enough to know that they have growth. There's still growth to be had. And they're curious about understanding more about themselves. When I say that they're foundational, I mean that they make all the other 6 touchstones possible. They reciprocally influence each other, and they intensify the effect inside the organization. So then I independently explored the 2 concepts of integrity and authenticity. But those two touchstones have a unique connection. You have to read the book to understand a little bit more about how that works, right? Both are central to self-growth, but they have a synergistic relationship, meaning that we need both of them inside the organization. Because, for instance, integrity is a foundational modifier to authenticity. You can't achieve that authenticity, right, with having that foundation of integrity. That's the thing that helps us harness the ever elusive authenticity, so to speak.
That's interesting. Before we get too far, can I just back up on courage just for a second? Yeah. And then I want to pick back up. Just on page 190 on courage, you just had this incredible chart. What I love is that there's concepts that I've harvested along the way that have felt very true, just really good things to build your life on. I feel like you've got then the research to back it up, and you also, the way you frame it just maybe makes it even that much more stickier in someone's brain. But you had this great chart around courage, and it had like the courage zone, the danger zone. Can you just talk about that for a second? Then I want to come right back to where you were.
Yeah. So this chart shows how each zone kind of contributes to the progression of performance, and how each relates to stress, anxiety, and fear. So the purpose is to show how courage building sustains. Think of it as everyday courage building, either in a leaders themselves, or with members of the team. And the idea is that if you take small steps just outside your comfort zone, and I have to give my good friend Bill Treasurer a little bit of a plug for this. He was the first person to really push the concept of everyday courage building into my mind. And that's his influence has really been integral in how I've expanded this concept of courage in the 9 touchstones. So when you operate inside your comfort zone, you use a very limited set of skills. And I will tell you that no growth happens inside your comfort zone. Okay. It's just nice and cozy there like a warm blanket. But when you step just outside that comfort zone into what we call the courage zone, anxiety does happen there. All right. Mm-hmm. But that anxiety, you've not gotten to the place of what we call the danger zone, where the anxiety is so intense that we're talking about negatively influencing health outcomes for members of teams, right? For leaders themselves. So if you push too far beyond the courage zone, the health outcomes, the wellness outcomes get impacted. That middle place, right, of the courage zone, just outside the comfort zone, is where real growth happens, and anxiety has a positive neurological and physiological impact on the body.
The term years ago that Quint Studer would use that stuck with my brain is that creative tension. Like you have too much slack in the system. You've got, if you ever worked out before, you pull a muscle, that's what you would call the danger zone, but it's that sweet spot of creative tension.
Yes.
Kind of that Goldilocks zone. So that, again, I feel like you're putting good science behind that. Well, let's go to where you had it, because actually I kind of got it, but I feel like the dime dropped in the way you said it. It's almost like this. Would it be accurate to say like a yin and yang relationship between integrity and authenticity, or would that not be a good visual?
I don't know if I would go yin and yang, because you can have one without the other. Mm-hmm. But then on the other side, you can't have the other one without the other one. Does that make sense? That was a little bit cyclical, right?
Yeah.
So you can live authentically who you are. Okay. And the example I use in the book is Hitler, right? Which is an extreme example, but I wanted people to, kind of go to that worst case scenario to really think really deeply about this concept of authenticity. Hitler was authentic to his cause. Would you think?
Yep. Actually, I love this because actually I use him quite often because it's a great litmus test to test a theory. In fact, my original, my book, the first 5 chapters, I had 4, and I was in a leadership training, and someone said, well, by your 4 definition, wouldn't Hitler? I'm like, ooh, there's something missing. So keep going.
Yeah. So you understand. I mean, you can have that authenticity, but often your actions may not have integrity. And I think that's why we make sure that both are there, and we discuss that modifier. On the other side, integrity is a big chapter, and there's a lot in there, because it really gets to the foundation of how do we live our values, right? How do we understand what our values are? How do we put our values to work in our everyday life? I even give some really great tools that I use with our clients and with my students to help them establish their values and then make them actionable, right? To use them as filters for decision making. You have to have some foundation of authenticity and desire to really live who you are, to live the core of who you are, to really fully embrace that integrity baseline. So they modify each other, but they modify each other differently. And I think it's important to the reason we included both in our behavioral model was because they're both necessary inside the enduring organization.
This is interesting. I'm just, again, you do have a superpower because I'm being very introspective. We have integrity as one of our core values. And back, one of the analogies we use is, John Wooden was such a great basketball coach. First thing he taught people was how to tie their shoes. And 5-star athletes were like, what are you going to teach me how to tie my shoes? But he was teaching them the foundations of excellence. And so we use that analogy in TCN. And so within TCN and Telias, that a deadline is only one or two things could occur. You meet the deadline or you renegotiate it. And that's the building blocks of modeling integrity within our organization. We have to be so true to our word, especially because of the nature of our work of supporting all these different hospices. But now I could look through the rearview mirror because we've more than hammered it. It's one thing if you talk about it. It's a whole nother thing if you live it and you have great storytelling around it. I find people are discovering their authentic selves more in this culture than anywhere I've ever worked before. Now, it's always a work in progress, going back to the Integrity Foundation. Is that what you're poking on? Am I kind of really messing up what you're teaching here?
No, I don't think, I think it is definitely on that right path. I think the authenticity piece for this model, we teach about the modifying relationship for sure, because part of my goal in writing the book was not just because I'm a big brainy nerd. You know, you said earlier I was a cool geek. I really appreciate that. I've been a geek my whole life. I don't think I've ever been called a cool geek. So thank you for that. I am a big nerd. And I have found that in my just annoying curiosity, which is the title of the curiosity chapter, annoying curiosity, I need to understand why something works if I'm going to change my mental set, if I'm going to change my approach to something I believe to be true, right? And so going back to these two touchstones, they have very unique functions inside the organization and how it makes the organization really rise to this high level where you're unleashing the potential of each unique person in the organization that ultimately gets you to that sustainable growth. But we have to understand how these touchstones modify each other, how they interact with each other. Sometimes for instance, when I'm working on emotional intelligence and I've progressed to the phase of, or the progression of social awareness, I'm also cultivating empathy, because empathy is the foundation of social awareness inside of emotional intelligence. So that's really why we did that. But authenticity as a touchstone is more about giving permission to people to bring their true and full selves to the workplace, because in that most authentic self, that's when they do their best work and at the lowest energy level possible. Does that make sense? So when you are living your authentic self, you're living your values, you are tapping into your superpowers, you actually exert less mental, emotional, spiritual energy. And so you're able to bring more of yourself to be more high performing, right? But you also bring a unique aspect to the organization that maybe someone else doesn't, right? And that's where you have this really collection of talents and skills that can be put to good use in the organization to elevate it even higher.
Yeah, that's good. That's, what I guess high performance athletes will call that flow state.
Yes.
That where it's just like the world. I was thinking something you said earlier made me think about that, where some incredibly high performers, virtuosic performers will say it's almost like the world slows down. Even though if you're watching the movie of it, it looks like it's like, fast paced, it's incredible. But they're in that flow state. Just one final thing. I love the Madeline Ridgway quote. Who were you before the world told you who you were? That one's going. Actually, I have it now on a sticker in my office because it's just so profound. Can you talk just a little bit more? Because maybe this is a good segue. I do want folks to go and get the book. And thank you for sharing all 9. I didn't even intend for you to actually say out loud all 9. I think they've got to read the book because the more you keep talking, me having read the book, I'm seeing now how the symbiosis doesn't even sound like the right word, but the interplay between all of them together. But can you talk about the brain science behind empathy, inclusivity, and gratitude?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So those are the team 3. So those really focus on how a leader will influence their team inside the organization. And the brain science really starts to look at the kind of the profound impact of social connections and personal growth when you take those 3 collectively. Empathy relies on an interplay of neural connections in the brain, and neuroscience shows that inclusivity activates the reward centers of the brain. So when you demonstrate inclusivity, the reward centers release neurotransmitters like dopamine, promoting like a really positive emotional response and reinforcing belonging inside of organizations. Gratitude, which is the third one, and frankly, one of my favorites. Gratitude also activates the brain's reward centers, and it releases those feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. So these all taken collectively, when you're talking about organizations that are lifting these 3 touchstones up, and especially leaders who are demonstrating them inside the workplace, It enhances the moods inside your organizations. It reduces stress. It improves overall mental health. That it also nurtures that social cohesion and it strengthens bonds inside of relationships. There's a lot of research behind how those specific neurotransmitters can drive trust-based relationships and how it drives strong performance inside of organizations.
That is so good. Just one final thing, and I'd love to get your final thoughts. I could do easily a 3 or 4 hour show with you. I'm not a huge fan of long form podcasting because very few people will listen to the whole thing, but you're just such a treasure of information. But one thing that nailed me, Jes, is in your chapter on resilience. So kind of truth here. Multitasking could damage your brain. This one just nailed me. Can you speak about that a little bit more?
I always use that as a little bit of a shock factor inside my workshops, if they haven't read the book, because we all do it and I do it still, right? But when I read the research on it, it was actually a Stanford University study. When I found this, it started making a lot more sense, especially. Let me take a step back. I want to share one thing about resilience and why this is so important. You may be asking, why is the touchstone resilience? If you think about the concept of resilience, the textbook definition of resilience is the ability to overcome adversity. But I wanted to challenge the notion that we should end at the period at the end of that sentence. I am a very resilient person by virtue of the experiences I've had across my lifetime. But sometimes I've done that to the point of exhaustion, right? At the expense of my body, my mind, my relationships, my health. And so I wanted to change the conversation around the concept of resilience, which is necessary, critical inside of organizations. So we call our resilience what we call energy-powered resilience. So we look at how instead of managing time, we manage energy inside of organizations. And one of the ways we do this is by looking at this concept that multitasking causes brain damage when we're putting too many things on too many people with no appropriate prioritization. Yes, it causes detrimental impacts to their brain, but it also makes them significantly less productive and causes the space where they're error prone, right? And so by doing good prioritization and allowing people to complete an important task, rest and recuperate as needed before they hit that point of exhaustion, you're actually eventually going to get to the surge where you have higher performance inside the workplace instead of working people to the point of exhaustion, which is our go-to, right? So that's really where that tie into the shocking brain damage concept comes in.
And thank you for going back, because given that context within the definition, it makes a whole lot more sense. And I love that about managing your energy as opposed to managing your time, because you will be most effective with your time if you are managing your energy. That's great. Just final thoughts?
I was thinking about, first of all, your great work. Thank you for the work that you're doing, Chris, and elevating leadership. I loved how you described using your framework and the podcast as a way to really flesh this out more, bring more awareness to these important concepts. I think more than anything, we're at I said it before, such an inflection point, right, in the workplace. And I really want the readers of 9 Leader Touchstones and, the people that embrace the Leader First model to feel inspired and motivated to take action. I want them to translate the knowledge and the insights from my stories and the stories I've shared of others, really to help them peel back the layers of their stories as well, so that they understand, are they on the right path for themselves as well? And I think that when we do this collectively, when more and more people start to look to self, that surge will come, right? And we'll see that progress, going back to that opening quote, we'll see that progress really start to happen.
That's so good, Jes. Well, we're going to include a link to your book, a link to your website, and then anything else you want to give us, we'll include links within the show notes, so that way people could reach out to you. And I really do hope that they get the book. In fact, there are several chapters I want to go back to just based upon this podcast. Thank you for the great work that you're doing in leaders across multiple segments, multiple industries. I believe in what John Maxwell says, everything rises and falls in leadership. And Jess, I know, and you'll experience this where actually you are because you have older and younger kids, but now my kids are entering the workplace. And a great place for people to work is more the exception and not the rule. And when you have your own kids going in the workplace, you want them to work in an organization where they're going to learn and grow and become better version of themselves. And you don't want that to be the search for the unicorn organization. You would hope there are many organizations out there. And because of people like you, I do believe that's becoming hopefully more the future that we're going into. We'll see. That's what this is all about.
I love it.
Thank you. To our listeners, in each episode, I always share a quote, a visual. The idea is we want to create a brain bookmark. This is going to be really hard for Jess's because there's so many great prodders, but a good thought prodder about the podcast subject just to further your learning and growth and thereby your leadership, and hopefully it sticks. Again, we call it a brain bookmark. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, The Anatomy of Leadership. We don't want you to miss an episode. Check out Jess's book. Check out The Anatomy of Leadership. Share it with your friends and coworkers. Share the podcast, especially this podcast, because there's a lot that they're going to get out of it. Thanks for listening to The Anatomy of Leadership. And here's our brain bookmark to close today's show.
Growth of any type, to be sustainable over time, needs to grow slowly. To Crescendo by Jes DeShields.